A pilot tried to subdue a black father mid-flight, but the legal authority on his side turned the tables instantly. A white man threw boiling tea on a black CEO's face mid-flight, believing the burn would end the mission. He didn't realize the CEO was minutes away from landing the jet himself and sealing a billion-dollar contract. The moment that tea hit skin, the whole cabin shifted. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true strength rises. The cabin door hissed shut behind them with a finality that made Dr. Marcell Varron's grip tighten subtly around his son's shoulder. He didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't raise an eyebrow, but he noticed. That subtle hiss didn't sound like routine. It sounded like a barrier locking behind them. Ahead, the aisle stretched into an elegant tunnel of first-class luxury, but Marcell's instincts, sharpened by years in high-pressure engineering negotiations, picked up something different, something artificial. "Seat 2A and 2B, right this way, sir," said a man in the blue uniform of CrestLume's staff. His voice carried a professional tone, but his eyes avoided contact, flickering nervously to the side before he turned. Marcell offered a polite nod, ushering 6-year-old Leron beside him. The boy clutched a small backpack shaped like a rocket ship and moved with the cautious obedience of a child used to waiting rooms and medical staff. Marcell smiled at him gently. "You're doing great," he murmured. "We'll be on the ground before you know it." Leron gave a small, brave nod, then pointed up at the seat number as they arrived. "That's our row," he whispered with a flicker of excitement. As they settled into the wide leather seats, Marcell glanced around, his usual survey of exits, passenger demographics, crew behavior. It was a habit, part engineering mind, part protective fatherhood. But this time, something unsettled him. The flight attendant stationed near the galley, tall, pale, late 30s, stood far too still. He adjusted his sleeve 3 times in under 10 seconds, and though his face wore a polite smile, his jaw clenched hard beneath it. Marcell recognized microtells. The man's name tag read Corvin. Every so often, Corvin glanced past the curtain into the cockpit, waiting for some unseen signal. Each time he looked, his shoulders twitched as if bracing for impact. Then came the next layer, the pilot. Marcell caught a glimpse through the cockpit door as it briefly opened to admit a crew member. A tall man with sandy brown hair and cold, calculating eyes stood behind the controls. He made direct eye contact with Marcell, not the kind of incidental glance professionals exchange, but a long, deliberate look, like someone assessing a variable that didn't belong. "Dad," Leron said softly, tugging on his sleeve, "that man is staring at us." Marcell shifted his body slightly, shielding his son's view. "It's all right," he replied gently. "Sometimes people just look. It doesn't mean anything." But inside, his thoughts shifted. No one else got that kind of inspection. No other passenger had been followed from the jet bridge to their seat with synchronized glances. Marcell had felt it before, in boardrooms where engineers tried to discredit his designs, and in defense sector briefings where words weren't allowed but intentions bled through posture. Corvin returned, standing too close this time. "Excuse me, sir," he began. "Is that a medical device your son is wearing?" Marcell blinked once, slowly. "Yes, it's a pediatric airflow regulator. Low-grade, non-invasive, doctor-certified. Documentation is uploaded to the airline registry." "I see." Corvin gave a rehearsed nod, but his hand subtly pressed the comm panel on the wall behind him. "Just a routine check. Nothing to worry about." But Marcell was already worrying. Not about turbulence or delays, about intent. The kind of intent that didn't announce itself, but organized, coordinated, crept. And Leron, unaware of the broader currents, leaned forward to examine the emergency card in the seat pouch. "Look, Dad," he said, "they made the airplane fold up like a robot." Marcell chuckled softly and leaned in. "That's the evacuation slide," he explained. "But yeah, it does look like that." He let the moment pass, if only to give Leron a breath of normalcy. But Marcell's attention remained divided, half on his son, half on the undercurrent. The intercom crackled. "This is your captain, Halden Trusk. We're preparing for departure. Weather's calm above us today. Should be a smooth ride into Norwin Haven." Marcell's eyebrows knit together ever so slightly. Halden Trusk. He remembered that name from somewhere, though the context slipped just beyond reach. It was only later that the full weight of it would return to him. The aircraft taxied. Engines thrummed low and steady. The runway lights rolled by in rhythmic intervals, and then the plane lifted into the sky, into something not quite routine. Around them, passengers relaxed, pulled out tablets, closed their eyes. But not Marcell. His posture remained upright, muscles deceptively loose, eyes occasionally darting toward the front of the aircraft. Corvin whispered something to another attendant near the lavatory. They didn't smile. They didn't laugh. Their expressions were clipped, controlled, as if under instruction. Dramatic irony coiled tighter in the quiet. None of the passengers knew what Marcell suspected. They believed this flight to be as safe and forgettable as any other. But buried in the crew's tension was something calculated, possibly rehearsed. Marcell reached for his wristband and tapped it once. Just a systems check, nothing recorded. Not yet, but it confirmed network presence, timestamp sync, and biometric readiness. He'd helped prototype this exact model for CrestLume's biometric identity system. It didn't just monitor health vitals, it could act as a silent witness. The cabin lights dimmed for ascent. Shadows stretched across the floor. Outside, the sky turned gold. Inside, Marcell whispered, more to himself than anyone else. It was the kind of quiet that only arrives before something breaks. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign fading out marked a quiet shift in the cabin atmosphere, but Marcell barely noticed. He had just opened his tablet, scrolling through Leron's recent spirometry charts. His eyes moved with clinical ease across the values, assessing his son's oxygen capacity under pressure, updating mental notes for the specialists awaiting them at Norwin Haven. Next to him, Leron sat quietly, legs curled beneath him, gripping a stuffed model plane Marcell had custom-designed during a long hospital stay. But across the cockpit, a very different conversation was unfolding. "Row 9, Seat B," Captain Halden Trusk muttered into the crew's private intercom, his voice clipped and icy. "That's our problem." First Officer Redden Vale glanced over from his station, puzzled. "The man with the kid?" Halden's jaw tensed. "Profile matches high-risk agitator. Overly attentive, overprepared, thinks too much." Vale frowned. "That's not a profile, that's just parenting." "Same thing," Halden snapped. "Just log it." While the words traveled between the cockpit walls, the cabin remained a serene portrait of mid-air normalcy, at least on the surface. Marcell adjusted Leron's mask slightly to ensure the airflow remained stable. The boy exhaled through his nose with a soft huff, his breath fogging the clear shell of the airflow funnel for a moment before vanishing. Then came the soft shuffle of polished shoes, Corvin Malrus, the flight attendant, moving down the aisle with a tray in hand and a false smile fixed like paint cracking at the edges. He paused at their row. "Sir," Corvin began, voice overly bright, "is that device FAA compliant? It's quite large." Marcell looked up, calm but watchful. "Yes, it was cleared during check-in. I have documentation, if you'd like to review it." Corvin didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, as though inspecting the device for a non-existent flaw. "It's just that sometimes these devices interfere with cabin pressure systems." "That's not how they work," Marcell said, keeping his voice even. "It's a sealed oxygen booster with passive flow regulation." Corvin blinked, thrown off by the clarity. "Still, I'll need to confirm it with the captain." "You're welcome to," Marcell replied, already anticipating the next obstruction. As Corvin walked away, Marcell's fingers hovered briefly over his tablet, then tapped into the wristband menu buried beneath its surface-level biometric readout. Just a diagnostic check for now, but the thought passed through him like current. They were probing, testing him, looking for an angle. Around them, passengers began to notice. A middle-aged man 1 row up furrowed his brow as he turned to glance back. A younger man across the aisle raised an eyebrow at Corvin's unusual attention. No one said anything yet, but the shift was perceptible. In the cockpit, Halden's hand hovered over a secured metal panel labeled Sedation Protocol Kit. His thumb ghosted the latch, but he didn't unlock it. Not yet. "He's being too careful," Halden muttered to himself. "That's always a sign." Redden Vale hesitated, but said nothing. His eyes shifted to the outdated label on the sedation cabinet, a cabinet he'd only ever seen referenced in manuals, never in use. Back in row 9, Corvin returned. "Sir," he said again, the false smile slipping into something firmer. "The captain has asked me to verify the device directly. Please hand it over for inspection." Marcell tilted his head. "You want to remove a medical breathing unit from a child mid-flight?" Corvin's jaw worked. Just for a moment. "No," Marcell said flatly. The tension doubled instantly. 2 rows ahead, a man began filming with his phone, holding it low behind a newspaper. Marcell noticed, and that was enough to delay his next move. Time, he reminded himself, was his best ally. "I have documentation," he repeated, slowly pulling up a digital file, "and it includes both the pre-flight clearance and TSA authorization." Corvin didn't take the tablet. He didn't even look at it. Instead, he gave a nod, too subtle for most to see, and turned sharply on his heel. Leron shifted in his seat. "Dad," he whispered, barely audible. "Why are they mad at us?" Marcell didn't answer right away. He gently unbuckled his son's belt and pulled him slightly closer, wrapping one arm around his narrow frame. "Just stay quiet," Marcell whispered back. "Listen to what they say. Watch where they stand. We'll be fine." The turbulence of suspicion grew thicker than any air pocket. The overhead lights flickered slightly, a common glitch, but in Marcell's mind, every anomaly was now a signal. He traced the pattern: false accusations, refusal to look at proof, planted suspicion. They weren't reacting to a real threat. They were hunting for justification. And worse, Marcell knew the body language. Halden, Corvin, they weren't improvising. They were executing something rehearsed, possibly used before. Marcell's gaze shifted toward the cockpit. The door remained closed, but a shadow passed behind the frosted glass. He knew what that cabinet held. He remembered the model from its discontinued briefing years ago. Tier 3 sedation tools, non-consensual application protocols, last used in detention transport aircraft before they were banned in commercial use. The mere presence of the kit meant the airline had quietly ignored federal withdrawal notices. He could feel the weight of eyes. Corvin again, lingering at the galley. Halden watching from behind the cockpit door. The coiled tension of anticipation. They were waiting for him to misstep. Marcell steadied his breath. If he panicked, they'd win. If he resisted, they'd escalate. But if he stayed alert, if he documented everything, if he moved with precision and calm, he could bend this narrative back toward truth. He brushed his thumb across the edge of the wristband again. The storm was forming long before the first drop fell. Without warning, Corvin claimed Marcell was interfering with safety operations by adjusting Leron's breathing mask, his voice sharp enough to make several nearby passengers turn their heads. The accusation came so abruptly, so confidently, that for a moment the entire row froze. Marcell looked up slowly, his expression calm but firm, holding the mask in place with steady hands. He answered with quiet restraint. "This is a prescribed device for my son's condition. I'm making sure he can breathe comfortably." His voice was measured, but a flicker of irritation rose behind his eyes. Corvin's stance tightened as he leaned closer, ignoring the rational explanation, insisting, "Sir, that device may not be permitted. You'll need to hand it over for inspection." The statement was so illogical that a man across the aisle frowned openly, whispering, "That makes no sense," to the passenger beside him. Marcell's patience thinned, but he refused to escalate. Instead, he subtly shifted Leron closer into his arms, his fingers brushing the small boy's trembling back as he prepared for whatever came next. Leron's breathing grew unsteady, and he clung to his father's shirt, burying his face to block out Corvin's looming presence. Then the atmosphere shifted sharply. Captain Halden Trusk stepped out of the cockpit and into the aisle with the heavy authority of someone who believed his decisions were beyond reproach. Pilots rarely left the cockpit during flight unless circumstances were extreme, and the passengers knew it. A ripple of unease moved through the cabin. Halden's footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost theatrical as he approached Marcell's row. His shoulders were stiff, his jaw clenched, and his eyes carried an unsettling certainty, as if he had already judged the situation before hearing a single word. Halden stopped directly over Marcell. "I've been informed you're creating a flight-wide danger," he declared, his tone cold and controlled. The words struck like a hammer, broad, unprovoked, and unmistakably strategic. Marcell blinked, surprised not by the accusation, but by how calculated it sounded. He opened his mouth to respond, but Halden didn't wait. He reached down abruptly, aiming to grab Marcell's arm as if the verdict had already been decided. Passengers gasped. A man in the back row stood halfway up. Leron cried out, startled by the sudden movement, and Marcell instinctively shielded him with his body, one arm pulling the boy close while the other braced against the seat. "Captain, please," Marcell said, voice steady but edged with warning. "My son is frightened. Just step back." Halden leaned in, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper that only those nearby could hear. "One more movement, and I will be forced to restrain you." His breath was slow and controlled, betraying the confidence of someone who believed the threat alone would win the moment. Dramatic irony filled the space around them. Halden believed he held complete power, unaware that Marcell's subtle tap on his wristband seconds earlier had activated a passive evidence recorder, quietly capturing every word and gesture. Leron sobbed softly into Marcell's chest, shaking. Marcell kept his voice low, whispering, "It's okay, I've got you," though his heart pounded in a rhythm that betrayed his calm facade. Around them, fear mingled with disbelief as passengers exchanged anxious looks, unable to understand why a simple adjustment of a child's medical device had spiraled into a confrontation with the pilot himself. Halden straightened, his gaze cutting toward the secured cabinet a few steps away, a cabinet marked with symbols most passengers didn't recognize, but which Marcell immediately did. The captain's eyes lingered too long on the latch, and a chill traveled through Marcell's spine. He knew what was inside. He knew it had no place here, and he knew Halden wasn't glancing at it out of curiosity. Corvin shifted nervously beside Halden, swallowing hard as if he sensed the shift into something far more dangerous than a routine dispute. Marcell could see it. The trembling fingers, the darting glance, the internal struggle of a man following orders he no longer fully understood. The aisle grew unbearably quiet, the sort of silence that arrives not from peace, but from collective dread. Every heartbeat, every breath, every whispered question in the cabin seemed to gather around that single, terrifying moment as Halden took one slow, deliberate step toward the cabinet. And in that step lay the first hint of catastrophe. Marcell tightened his hold on Leron, feeling the weight of responsibility sharpen into urgency. His mind raced. He needed to anticipate, to remain calm, to survive whatever Halden intended to do next. He inhaled once, steadying himself, preparing for the escalation he could no longer prevent. The tension coiled like a fuse burning toward an inevitable spark, and every passenger felt it, even if they didn't yet understand its meaning. The moment he reached for the cabinet, Every breath in the cabin felt borrowed. Captain Halden didn't hesitate. With a swift motion that sliced through the thick silence of the cabin, he unlocked the overhead compartment just left of the cockpit. The metal latch clicked open, exposing a padded interior where a matte black object lay secured, a Tier 3 Tranquilizer unit. Its surface was scratched but functional. The faded red warning triangle above the trigger a grim reminder that this device was meant for wild animal suppression, not human passengers. The moment it was visible, a ripple of alarm passed through the cabin. A few passengers gasped aloud. One man in the second row leaned into the aisle, phone already recording, while another whispered, "Is that even legal?" The tension fractured into something closer to dread. Halden's voice rang out, flat and official sounding. "This is under Emergency Protocol 711D. Sit down and remain calm." But the code he cited didn't exist in any current aviation database. Marcell knew it, and so did at least 2 other passengers who worked in regulatory consulting. But fear had a way of paralyzing action. Corvin Malrus stood behind the captain, his posture rigid, hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles blanched. His eyes flicked nervously toward Marcell and the boy. Leron whimpered and pressed his face against his father's chest. "Dad, what is that thing?" Marcell kept his voice even. "It's going to be fine. Just breathe slow with me. Like we practiced, remember?" But Marcell's mind was calculating at speed. The aisle was narrow. Passengers were frozen in their seats, most too afraid to move, some fumbling with phones under tray tables. Halden's trigger finger hovered too confidently. He was prepared for this. That meant he had either rehearsed it mentally or carried out something similar before. The red LED on the side of the launcher blinked 3 times. Rapid injection mode engaged. Not standard, not safe. Marcell didn't rise. He knew standing would be framed as aggression. He also knew that staying seated wouldn't necessarily protect them. His only movement was subtle. He shifted Leron closer, angling his own body to cover his son entirely. If he fires, Marcell thought, he won't get both of us. Halden raised the launcher. "You've interfered with safety procedures and resisted orders. This is your final warning." "Captain," Marcell said carefully, each word measured like an engineer balancing airflow through a failing jet engine. "My son's breathing equipment is medically certified. You fabricated codes. This is not emergency protocol. This is escalation." "Enough," Halden snapped. "You're a risk to the cabin and your own child. You refused compliance." Without another word, Halden pulled the trigger. The dart flew with a mechanical hiss. It struck Marcell's left shoulder with a sickening thump, embedding itself into muscle. A chemical sting spread instantly through his arm, numbing the limb almost to the bone. Marcell's breath hitched, his body locking for half a second before the pain bloomed fully, dragging him sideways in his seat. A collective scream rose from the front half of the cabin. Someone shouted, "What are you doing?" Another voice near the rear cried, "That's assault!" But the crew made no move to stop the pilot. Corvin's face twisted, but he didn't step forward, only flinched backward as if the violence belonged to someone else's hands. Leron shrieked, "Dad!" and tried to climb into his lap. Marcell's good arm wrapped around his son, holding him tightly. His head swam. His vision blurred. But his instincts fought back, not in violence, but in preparation. With his right hand, he reached down and double-tapped the side of his wristband recorder. A green light blinked faintly near his wrist bone, transmitting. His body slumped slightly, dragged down by the dart's chemical load. But he stayed awake. Halden didn't stop. He turned back toward the cabinet, adjusted the launcher, and locked eyes on Leron. "Corvin," he said coldly, "remove the child for containment and observation." Corvin froze. The passengers behind them erupted. "You're aiming that thing at a kid? Is this real? Somebody stop him." But Halden ignored them. He tilted the weapon down slightly toward Leron's small body. Corvin took one uncertain step forward. "Sir." He's a child. This isn't part of— Do it, Halden ordered. Now. Marcell, eyes half-lidded, saw Corvin's foot inch forward. His heart pounded against the chemical haze, but he didn't loosen his grip on Leron, didn't blink, didn't breathe harder than necessary. The wristband's green light kept pulsing. The camera in it, miniaturized and designed for environmental stress testing, captured everything. Passengers no longer whispered. Some stood. A man near the emergency exit fumbled with the wall intercom. A younger passenger jumped into the aisle. The dynamic had changed. Fear was becoming fury. And in that instant, the line between fear and fury snapped. Marcell collapsed, but not entirely. The tranquilizer had found its mark, embedding into the muscle of his left shoulder, but the dosage had been calibrated for a full-grown male with no specialized training. Halden had no idea that Marcell had once undergone high-altitude simulation trials, where learning to regulate breath under near-fainting conditions wasn't just recommended, it was required. That training surged forward like muscle memory. Though his limbs turned sluggish and the cabin around him blurred into streaks of movement and shadow, Marcell clung to a single objective: shield Leron. His right arm refused to respond. His neck sagged slightly forward, but his back, curved over his son like the protective shell of an aircraft fuselage, remained locked. Through the din of passengers gasping and the shouted warnings of flight attendant Corvin Malris, Marcell heard the exact phrase Halden barked from above: "Remove the child for safety review." There was no protocol with that phrasing. Marcell knew it. Halden knew it. And somewhere deep in the instinctive heart of every passenger who heard it, they too recognized the hollowness behind the words. Corvin stepped forward hesitantly, one gloved hand outstretched toward Leron. The boy screamed, not in tantrum, but in pure, bottomless terror. He clutched the front of his father's shirt with both fists, refusing to let go. Corvin grimaced, caught between Halden's threat and the overwhelming fear in Leron's eyes. Around them, passengers stood, some placing hands on seats for balance as they shifted their bodies into defensive stances. An elderly man toward the rear, a retired systems engineer named Davin Kroll, stepped into the aisle. "That's a child," Davin said firmly, his voice cutting through the confusion like a blade. "You will not take him from his father." Halden turned sharply, the dart launcher still gripped in his dominant hand. Its indicator light glowed red, armed and ready for another shot. "Return to your seat, or you'll be charged with obstruction," he growled. His voice had slipped into something unhinged, no longer controlled, no longer just angry. It was the voice of someone who realized control was slipping through his fingers. "You already tranquilized one passenger under false authority," Davin replied, not backing down. "You think you'll survive a second?" Halden raised the weapon. A collective gasp swept the cabin. Several passengers pointed phones now, recording. One even shouted, "It's being streamed live." But Halden, blinded by spiraling command panic, didn't lower his hand. His finger hovered dangerously close to the trigger. Marcell, his mind sharpened by the adrenaline threading through the tranquilizer fog, knew this was the breaking point. Inside his chest, his heart pumped more than blood. It pumped memory. He recalled the emergency code from his days working as a lead interface designer on classified aerospace platforms. The code had been seared into his training, not for warfare, but for ungoverned emergencies. One phrase unlocked an override. One mental trigger could convert a recording device into a legal beacon. Warrant trigger, emergency custodian protocol. Marcell whispered it under his breath, lips barely moving, hoping the wristband's voice recognition would catch the phrase even through slurred speech. There was no visual feedback, no light, no vibration. But if the firmware still functioned as designed, the command had gone through. Meanwhile, Corvin made one more attempt to reach for Leron, but the boy pushed backward, hiding beneath his father's half-limp body. "Stop," he cried. "Please don't take me." Passengers broke protocol completely now. One man stepped into the aisle next to Davin. A younger voice from the opposite row called out, "Leave them alone. He's protecting his kid." Corvin stepped back, his eyes now flicking to Halden's. "I think we're crossing lines," he muttered. Halden, jaw clenched, barely heard him. His eyes had locked onto the crowd forming between him and what he thought was submission. Dramatic irony dripped from every frame being recorded. Halden believed he still had authority, not knowing that a digital signal had already left the cabin through an encrypted uplink. Unbeknownst to him, Marcell's wristband recorder had just uploaded the entire footage of the incident, complete with biometric triggers, timestamps, and audio logs, to a cloud node maintained by the Federal Department of Airspace Ethics Tribunal. The protocol, once triggered, was designed to send out 3 pings, one to the tribunal, one to the Federal Aviation Oversight Court, and one to the Emergency Custodian Contact Registry. All Halden saw was a father collapsed on the floor and a terrified boy clinging to him. But the tides had already shifted. The tranquilizer's effects began to wear thin, partially because the dart had struck muscle rather than a major artery. Marcell felt the tingle of circulation creeping back into his right fingers. Every instinct screamed for him to move, to lunge, to disarm. But he didn't. Not yet, because his strength wasn't in sudden retaliation. It was in proof, in patience, in protocol, in the law. Corvin stood frozen. Passengers murmured louder. Phones kept recording. Marcell didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The systems had already begun activating beyond the clouds, beyond the flight path, beyond Halden's shrinking sphere of control. He waited for his right arm to return, because the return shot would not come from rage, but from the law itself. The aircraft cabin descended into chaos. The moment the tranquilizer dart struck Dr. Marcell Varron's shoulder, the illusion of order shattered like thin glass. Voices collided in the narrow pressurized air, passengers rising from their seats with disbelief etched across their faces. Some cried out in protest, others fumbled with their phones, activating the in-flight communication network to try and call for help. The hum of the engines was now drowned beneath a rising tide of outrage and fear. "Sit down! Everyone sit down!" Captain Halden Trusk bellowed, his voice cutting through the panic like a whip. His uniform, once a symbol of calm leadership, now looked like a costume worn by a man unraveling in real time. He spun toward Flight Attendant Corvin Malrus and snapped, "Initiate emergency cabin lockdown, now!" Corvin hesitated, sweat dotting his brow. His eyes flicked toward Marcell, who was slumped forward in his seat, his arm limp, shielding his trembling son with what strength remained. Corvin's voice cracked. "Are you sure we should?" "Now, Corvin!" Halden shouted again. With shaking hands, Corvin punched a sequence into the cabin control panel behind the galley wall. A soft, metallic clunk echoed as the cockpit sealed with an automatic latch, cutting the crew off from all external communications. Emergency broadcasts were jammed. The digital line to tower control at Norwin Haven went dark. Halden exhaled like a man who believed he had secured his kingdom. "That buys us time," he muttered, eyes scanning the passengers who were now murmuring like a hive of unrest. But he didn't know that time had already slipped from his grasp. Marcell, pale and slouched, was not unconscious. Through labored breaths and intense pain, he had activated the one safeguard Halden could never have predicted. The Emergency Custodian Protocol, a federal override embedded in a biometric device that now pulsed faint red from his wristband. The signal had already gone out. The response had already begun. Marcell's lips barely moved. He whispered into the embedded microphone, voice broken but clear enough to trigger voice pattern recognition. "Varron, Marcell, Custodian Class 5, dependent present. Medical force applied without legal warrant. Identity confirmed. Protocol in effect." The system, silent to everyone else, roared to life in encrypted airspace above them. Within seconds, the signal pinged across secured federal channels, bypassing commercial systems entirely. A magistrate with the Department of Airspace Ethics Tribunal, seated thousands of miles away, reviewed a live stream captured directly from Marcell's wristband. Blood visible on his collar, child pressed against his chest. Dart wound clearly showing signs of sedation attempt. The tribunal officer didn't blink. He signed the digital warrant with a sweep of his hand. Back in the sky, Halden strolled the aisle with his shoulders high, projecting authority to the rattled passengers. "We're experiencing a security situation," he announced with false calm. "Everything is under control. Please remain seated." The dramatic irony thickened like storm clouds. Halden believed he had silenced his adversary. He believed the cockpit's locked status meant victory. But down below, wheels were turning fast. The warrant had already reached Norwin Haven's legal landing response team. The federal override had not summoned help to the plane, it had summoned justice to the runway. In row 7A, Marcell's eyelids fluttered open. His arms still felt like dead weight, but his breathing was controlled, shallow, trained. Not far away, Leron clung to his father's chest like a life raft, his small fists clutching the fabric of Marcell's jacket. "I'm okay," Marcell whispered. "Don't move, little one." Halden paced like a predator who thought he had won, unaware the trap he set had activated one beneath his own feet. As he passed by Corvin again, he leaned in. "Keep the child isolated when we land. We'll sort this out before terminal security gets involved." Corvin didn't answer. His eyes flicked to Marcell's wristband, still blinking, still alive. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. But Halden's voice left no room for dissent. In the rear of the cabin, several passengers conferred quietly. One, a gray-haired man named Bram, opened the compliance app on his tablet. His brow furrowed. That code he used, 731 Wild Detain, it's not even valid anymore. But his voice was drowned out by another round of commands from Halden as he re-entered the cockpit. Marcell used the moment. The signal was sent. His voice print was verified, and with it came a silent flash of approval on the band, confirmation of tribunal action engaged. His body ached, his vision blurred, but something deeper inside him, the part trained to operate under impossible G-forces and emergency decompressions, knew the worst was over. Not in pain, not in panic, but in the slow turning of consequences now barreling toward Halden like an avalanche. The passengers didn't know it yet. Halden certainly didn't. But beneath the cabin's sealed doors, justice was no longer waiting for landing clearance. It was already descending. The higher he flew in arrogance, the harder gravity prepared to reclaim him. Marcell's head lifted from the armrest, the motion slow, deliberate, as pain spiked through his shoulder. His body was weak, but his mind, trained by years of precision engineering and high-pressure systems, was sharp and calculating. The sting of the tranquilizer still burned in his muscles, but Leron's trembling body pressed against him gave him focus. His boy was still here, still breathing, still scared. Corvan Malrus hesitated just a few steps away, eyes flickering between Marcell and the cockpit. The flight attendant's posture was no longer confident. It was fractured, his shoulders hunched like a man caught between two collapsing walls. Halden's voice barked from the cockpit. "Separate the child. He's a safety risk if the father regains control." But Corvin didn't move. He looked at Leron, the boy's wide eyes, the desperate grip on his father's arm, and for the first time since boarding, Corvin faltered. In row 4B, Bram Vaylor, a passenger with calm eyes and the quiet manner of someone used to reading contracts instead of confrontation, leaned forward. He had been watching, listening. A legal logistics consultant by trade, Bram had worked cases involving outdated emergency authority protocols. He pulled out his personal screen, tapped into the aircraft's compliance interface, publicly accessible by regulation, and began scrolling through the flight's administrative tags. His eyes narrowed. 731 Wild Detain, Bram said aloud, his voice slicing through the tension like a crack in glass. "That code hasn't been valid in 7 years." His words hung in the cabin like a dropped knife. Several passengers turned, confusion mixing with dawning outrage. Bram stood now, tall and steady. "Captain Halden activated a deprecated authority tag. That's illegal under the revised passenger conduct statute." Corvin took a step back. Halden didn't. The pilot stormed out of the cockpit again, his stride faster this time, desperate. "You don't have the authority to declare what's valid," he growled at Bram. "I don't need to," Bram replied, lifting his screen. "The system does. It logged your override, and the tribunal logs are mirrored post-flight." Murmurs turned to voices. A man across the aisle stood. Another, near the front, crossed his arms. Slowly, a human wall formed between Halden and the rows where Marcell and Leron sat. The cabin was no longer a line of passengers. It was a jury box. Halden's face flushed red, but not from heat, from loss of control. He spun back toward the cockpit, barking, "Initiate lockdown protocol." Emergency diversion. Passenger threat escalating. Screens in the cabin flickered, locking into a blue field labeled Emergency Override, Code HAL 81. The safety animation loop halted. The entertainment systems froze. The silence was replaced with a low, mechanical hum, as though the aircraft itself had been placed in solitary. In the cockpit, Redden Vale sat frozen at the controls. He had executed the lockdown on command, but his conscience hadn't locked with it. His eyes drifted to the control panel, then to the small sticker on the overhead console, Standard Operating Thresholds, Clause 14, Sedative Use on Minors, Prohibited. Vale remembered another name, Commander Tresk. A flight 6 years ago. Another fabricated threat. Another use of restraint tools for control. That commander had been court-martialed. Vale had watched it happen, had testified, and now he was watching the same signs echo again. Corvin leaned close to Vale in the cockpit doorway, voice barely audible. "I didn't sign up to shoot children," he whispered, sweat beading under his collar. Vale didn't answer. Not with words. His hand slowly reached for the internal recording switch on the overhead panel, toggling it without a sound. The cockpit's audio feed, now documenting Halden's every word, every reckless order, began transmitting to the onboard flight recorder and, quietly, to Vale's secure personal cloud. Back in the aisle, Marcell shifted. His left arm was still numb, but his fingers curled weakly around Leron's wrist, grounding the boy. Around them, Bram knelt, shielding them with his frame. "Is Dad going to be okay?" Leron whispered. "Yes," Marcell rasped, but only because some people still remember the rules. The tension in the air had changed. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was resistance. A moral uprising that unfolded not with fists, but with facts. Halden stood at the front of the cabin, glaring at the line of men now blocking his path. "You're obstructing a lawful command," he snapped. Bram didn't move. "And you're impersonating a valid authority tag under revoked regulation. This isn't a chain of command anymore. It's a chain of accountability." For the first time, Halden stepped back. Passengers didn't cheer. They didn't need to. What settled in the space between them was more powerful than applause. It was consensus. Agreement that something had gone wrong, and it was no longer going unchecked. The aircraft still moved through the clouds. The seatbelt lights still glowed, but the power had shifted. Not with force, with awareness. And behind it all, Marcell breathed slower now, every second reclaiming a little more of his strength. He didn't speak again, but he didn't need to. The truth was being spoken around him, and it was enough. The cabin was no longer a vessel in the sky. It had become a courtroom in motion. The attacker smirked, thinking the pain would break the CEO, unaware that every clause, every investor on standby, and every witness in the cabin was about to see what resilience really looks like. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when discipline meets purpose, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. On the ground at Norwin Haven Terminal, the response was swift, almost unnervingly coordinated. The moment the custodian protocol activated from Marcell's wristband transmission, the Office of High Custodial Affairs assembled at the restricted side of the tarmac. Their arrival was quiet, almost surgical, creating an atmosphere that tower staff would later describe as the calm before a courtroom storm. Magistrate Darvin Kell stepped out of the transport vehicle first, his expression stern beneath the terminal floodlights. He carried the electronic warrant tablet in one hand, its blue seal still glowing from the verification stamp he had approved minutes earlier. The officers behind him, each wearing the pale gray insignia of custodial authority, formed a precise formation, awaiting Kell's instruction. Inside the terminal's operations bay, Kell listened as the flight plan supervisor briefed him on the approaching aircraft. "Flight 912 is beginning descent," the supervisor reported, his voice tight with a mixture of urgency and disbelief. Kell nodded once, his jaw firm. "Keep the runway clear. This landing will proceed without disruption, but there will be no standard deboarding." His tone held no hesitation, only the certainty of a man who understood the weight of a protocol many had never seen activated in their lifetime. Back in the sky, Halden remained unaware that his world was collapsing below him. Walking the aisle with a forced authority, he tapped the back of seats, projecting a sense of control that had long since slipped from his grasp. "Passenger misconduct will be documented," he announced, his voice echoing with false command as he leaned toward Corvin at the galley. "Prepare the log to reflect that the disturbance was caused by the father. Write that he refused safety instructions." Corvin nodded, but his hands trembled. His breathing quickened, betraying the fear he could no longer conceal. Marcell, watching from several rows away, felt a cold heaviness form in his chest. The danger was not only the tranquilizer, it was the lies being woven into a story designed to condemn him. Redden Vale, seated stiffly in the cockpit only moments earlier, made his decision. He stepped back inside, activated a hidden audio channel on his console, and quietly stated, "Recording. Cockpit internal." His voice was barely above a whisper. Each of Halden's instructions, each fabricated claim, each tactic meant to distort the truth, transferred into a secure relay that Vale directed to the terminal authorities. His palms were damp, his heartbeat elevated, but his conscience stood firmer than it ever had under Halden's command. In the cabin, Marcell sat upright now with the assistance of Bram Vaylor and two male passengers who had taken positions near his row, forming a protective boundary. The tranquilizer's effects still lingered in his muscles, but his focus sharpened as Leron's small hand clutched his sleeve. Marcell bent close, his voice low and steady. "When we land," he whispered, brushing Leron's trembling hair aside, "don't let go of my hand, no matter what they say." Leron nodded, his eyes wide but trusting, the kind of trust that pushed Marcell to stay awake despite the dizziness threatening to reclaim him. The aircraft dipped lower, engines humming with the familiar tone of final descent. But there was nothing familiar about the tension thickening the air. Passengers exchanged silent looks, sensing the gravity of what awaited them. A man in the row across leaned forward, whispering, "Something's happening down there. I can feel it." His voice carried not fear, but anticipation, a sense that justice for once was moving faster than wrongdoing. Outside, the legal retrieval unit positioned themselves at the marked approach line where the jet bridge connected. They reviewed the warrant again, confirming the charges: assault using unauthorized medical force, obstruction of custodial protection, falsification of emergency protocols. Each officer's expression hardened as they understood the rarity of what they were about to enforce. "No mistakes," Kell reminded them. "We serve the warrant the moment the cabin door opens." As the aircraft's wheels met the runway with a sharp hiss, The scene unfolded with cinematic precision. The plane rolled toward its designated gate, guided by tower control who had received strict instructions not to intervene or question any unusual personnel movements. Inside the cabin, Halden straightened his uniform and turned to Corvin. "When we disembark, escort the father to the security corridor," he ordered, now confident that he would finish the narrative he had constructed. His posture radiated superiority. A final gesture before the truth he had tried to bury rose to confront him. Redden Vale didn't look at Halden as the aircraft taxied. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, silently counting the seconds until the inevitable confrontation. He knew the moment the cabin door opened, Halden's authority would evaporate like breath against cold glass. Marcell exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He could feel the aircraft slowing, feel the weight of the moment pressing against the cabin walls. Passengers leaned into the aisle, waiting, anticipating, watching. Outside, Kell raised his hand, signaling his officers. "Positions," he instructed. "When that door opens, we move." The aircraft stopped. The engines quieted. The bridge connected with a muted click, and as the cabin door creaked open, the legal team prepared to execute an unprecedented action, serving a warrant on the tarmac for assault committed midair by a federal officer using unauthorized medical force. Because justice wasn't waiting at the courtroom, it was waiting by the jet bridge. The aircraft wheels screeched against the tarmac, jolting slightly as they kissed the ground with a hiss. Inside the cabin, a false quiet descended, heavy and too well timed to be natural. Captain Halden Trusk stood rigid near the cockpit, his jaw clenched and eyes narrowed. Over the intercom, he instructed the crew with cold precision, "Disembark passengers in reverse row order." His voice betrayed none of the tension swimming behind his eyes, but the intent was clear. This wasn't protocol. It was manipulation. By controlling the flow of passengers, he aimed to isolate Marcell Varron and his son, Leron, keeping them out of view, out of earshot, and, most importantly, out of record. Flight attendant Corvin Malrus obeyed robotically, stepping down the aisle with a shaky clipboard. Redden Vale remained in the cockpit doorway, silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Passengers murmured uneasily, shifting in their seats, glancing toward Marcell, who sat upright now, bruised but resolute, cradling Leron in one arm. The boy's small hands clutched his father's jacket tightly, his face buried beneath the collar, hiding from the memory of the dart. Halden signaled Corvin with a short nod. "Move them last. Wait until the aisle is clear." But before Corvin could respond, the front cabin door opened with a sharp hiss and metallic thud. The first figure to appear was not a ground crew member, nor a flight attendant from another shift. It was a man in a black overcoat, formal but unflinching, flanked by 3 officers in charcoal-gray tribunal uniforms and 2 legal marshals bearing the seal of the Passenger Ethics Tribunal. The group moved as one, firm boots echoing on the entry steps. Magistrate Darvin Kell's voice cut through the cabin like a wire through taut silk. "Captain Halden Trusk," he said, each word calm and lethal, "you are hereby served with an emergency warrant for criminal assault, misuse of medical restraint devices, and obstruction of custodial protection under Clause 7 of the Passenger Protection Decree." The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees in a breath. Halden's mouth parted slightly, but the sound caught in his throat like gravel. He stepped back instinctively, one hand drifting toward his belt, not in aggression, but in disbelief. The passengers around him froze in place as if time had thickened. Corvin dropped the tablet he'd been gripping, the plastic cracking audibly against the floor. He backed away, muttering, I didn't know it went that far." But no one answered. Redden Vale stepped forward in slow silence and, without a word, extended a small drive from his pocket to the nearest officer. It contained his full recording of the cockpit channel. Magistrate Kell did not pause. With practiced ease, he signaled to the legal marshals who approached Halden without hesitation. You have the right to remain silent until tribunal proceedings commence. You have violated aviation code." "No," Halden said suddenly, voice cracking. "You can't do this." He was resisting. He was a threat. Marcell, still seated, lifted his head at last. His breath came evenly now. His eyes held no anger, only quiet clarity. The clarity of a man who had expected this moment, who had prepared for it down to the syllable. Across the cabin, a smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing in volume. Passengers stood slowly, one by one, not out of celebration but in solemn affirmation. Not for revenge, not for spectacle, but for the simple, sacred idea that what was wrong had been acknowledged, and what was right had stepped through the cabin door in broad daylight. Marcell rose carefully, wincing but steady, and lifted Leron into his arms. The boy blinked against the cabin lights, confused but safe. As the marshals fastened cuffs around Halden's wrists, Marcell took one step forward, then paused. His voice was low, meant only for Leron. "Remember this moment, son, not because we were hurt, but because we were heard." Halden was already halfway down the jet bridge when the voices began rising behind him. "Captain Halden Trusk," a firm voice called out, cutting through the stagnant air like a gavel striking hardwood. He stopped in his tracks, turning slowly. The faces of passengers, still inside the aircraft, pressed toward the cabin doorway in stunned silence. At the foot of the ramp stood Magistrate Darvin Kell, flanked by two officers in midnight blue tribunal coats, their silver insignias catching the overhead lights. Cameras clicked. A boom mic rose into view. This wasn't a quiet arrest, it was the kind Halden had always feared. Public, procedural, and irreversible. "In view of the assembled officers and civilian witnesses," Kell continued, his voice unwavering, "you are hereby served with an emergency warrant for criminal assault, misuse of medical restraint devices, and obstruction of custodial protection under Clause 7 of the Passenger Protection Decree." The terminal fell quiet. Halden opened his mouth, but no words came. His shoulders tensed as if to resist, but his hands were already being secured by the tribunal officers. The rigid click of the cuffs echoed beneath the terminal archway. His eyes darted, no longer with arrogance but with confusion. He looked for allies, found none. Redden Vale stood at the edge of the ramp, head lowered, holding out a sealed data chip. "Cockpit audio logs," he said plainly to the nearest officer. "All time-stamped." Behind them, Marcell stepped forward with Leron in his arms, Bram Vaylor steadying his side with a careful hand. The child's small arms clutched his father's neck tightly, eyes wide as they passed the scene. Officers created a respectful lane. Journalists, alerted by an anonymous tip from Vale's assistant, had already gathered behind a secured glass wall. But they didn't shout. They didn't swarm. They simply watched as the once feared pilot was led away in silence. The tribunal officers guided Halden to a waiting vehicle outside, where he was placed in the back seat without ceremony. Cameras rolled. Microphones recorded as the charges were read again, this time into the official public record. The words had weight now. They weren't threats. They were consequences. Inside the airport, the scene replayed on every terminal screen. Travelers paused mid-stride to read the headline scrolling in bold red. "Pilot tranquilizes passenger. Legal override activated mid-air." Below it, a still image from the cabin showed Marcell curled over his son, Corvin retreating in the background, Halden's arm frozen mid-extension, tranquilizer unit still visible. The pressure of the moment bore down on Corvin Malrus, who sat pale in the operations holding room. His hands trembled as he signed the consent form for legal counsel. When questioned under oath that same evening, he admitted to the tribunal that Halden had orchestrated the confrontation, choosing Marcell as a target because he wanted to test response limits and see if protocol loopholes still held up. Corvin's voice cracked on the final word, but it was enough. The audio logs corroborated the claim. Every whisper between cockpit and cabin, every false emergency code, every invented phrase, they were all preserved. In the courtroom that night, Halden appeared before Magistrate Kell, this time no longer on a jet bridge but behind reinforced glass. Kell read the charges again, slower now, making sure each syllable left its mark. The restricted Tier 3 Tranquilizer, the fabricated 731 Wild Detain Protocol, the attempt to separate a child from his legal guardian under a false safety pretense. "You will be held without bail," Kell declared, pending full review due to the nature and severity of the violations committed aboard CrestLume Flight 912. In a secured chamber adjacent to the courtroom, Marcell provided his testimony through a live deposition. Leron sat beside him, head resting on his lap, eyes already drifting into sleep. Marcell's voice was calm, controlled. He recounted each moment, punctuating his words with clips from the wristband stream, clear footage of Halden's assault, Corvin's attempt to seize the breathing device, and the precise moment the tranquilizer dart fired. The tribunal asked him if he wished to request damages or demand a formal apology. Marcell looked at them, tired but resolute. "I don't want an apology," he said, "and I don't want revenge. I want accountability, because no man should be tranquilized for protecting his child." News of the incident hit the national airwaves like a lightning strike. There was no soft let-in, no gentle rollout. It was headline after headline, minute after minute. Pilot tranquilizes father in mid-air dispute, legal override activated by passenger's wristband. The footage, raw, grainy, and recorded by half a dozen passengers, circulated across every major network. The opening frame, frozen in every article, showed Dr. Marcell Varron slumped over his 6-year-old son, Leron, the dart still embedded in his shoulder, while chaos erupted around them in the narrow aisle of CrestLume Flight 912. But it wasn't the dart that shifted the nation's attention. It was the precedent. The custodian protocol, an obscure and rarely discussed legal override tied to biometric clearance for defense sector professionals, had been triggered mid-air. And it worked. A father under sedation, a child nearly taken, a warrant served before the plane even taxied to the gate. For most, it sounded like science fiction. For Marcell, it was a quiet contingency embedded in the systems he had once helped design. His phone, once a rarely used tool outside of engineering briefs, now buzzed with messages from legal advocacy groups, aerospace engineers, ethicists, and thousands of concerned parents. Some asked for his testimony. Some asked for interviews. But many simply wrote, "Thank you for proving we're not paranoid." The fear that airline crew authority had expanded without oversight had lived beneath the surface for years. Marcell's case didn't create the storm. It revealed it. Back in Corin Hollow, Marcell stood at his home desk staring at the now famous wristband. The design was his, originally built for tracking biometric fluctuations in high-G simulations. He had helped write the firmware years ago. But now, thanks to an obscure patch in its operating system, the device had served as more than a monitor. It had become a witness. A digital eye when human ones failed. The public had dubbed it the return shot, a phrase born from a quote in a tribunal hearing that spread faster than any press release. It was never designed to defend, but when used with truth, it became the dart that flew back. Marcell turned the device slowly in his fingers, its surface reflecting the warm morning light. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. It had worked. But the price still echoed in the quiet panic Leron showed whenever someone raised their voice too fast in public. The child had returned to his routine medical evaluations, now accompanied by Bram Vaylor, the former passenger-turned-friend who had stood between the aisle and injustice. Bram brought books, snacks, gentle stories about how sometimes good people have to stand louder than bad rules. "Will they try again?" Leron had asked once, sitting in the sterile pediatric room with a toy in hand. "No," Marcell replied, "not if we make sure they can't." Those words weren't born from vengeance. They came from weariness. The kind of weariness that follows a man after he's had to remain calm with a tranquilizer in his blood and a gun pointed at his child. It didn't take long for industry to react. At least 3 major airlines grounded select crews and called for immediate retraining. The Federal Aviation Ethics Committee convened an emergency review of all restraint device classifications. Multiple senators, now under pressure from constituents, demanded audits of onboard emergency equipment and legal powers. Marcell received a quiet invitation, not to testify, but to serve. The Federal Aviation Ethics Review Board offered him a part-time position, not just as a figurehead, but as an architect of reform. He hesitated only once. Then he accepted. On his first day, a junior advisor asked him what his vision was. Marcell responded without blinking. Prevention. He didn't want retaliation. He didn't want a legacy of retribution. What he wanted was regulation that could not be rewritten in the sky by fear or favoritism. He wanted every cabin crew member to know that the moment they chose to raise a weapon or inject fear into a peaceful family, that their actions would be judged not after the flight, but during it. Meanwhile, Leron began to recover, though not without pauses. At night, he sometimes still woke up asking if the pilot man was coming back. Each time, Marcell sat with him, holding his hand until his breathing calmed. "You're safe," he'd whisper. And when Bram visited, they would watch cartoons together, with Bram joking that no villain ever wins when the good guys wear wristbands. Still, the weight of what had happened never truly left. It clung to Marcell in small ways, the way he scanned every flight manifest twice now, or the way he instinctively moved between Leron and the aisle when they boarded their next plane. Yet something had changed across the system. A code had been written into the culture. Silent authority was no longer silent. The wristband became a symbol across the tech world, featured in lectures and exhibitions as a case study in ethical design. Engineers, once obsessed with efficiency, now asked, "Can this protect, too?" In the months that followed, Marcell was asked what lesson he wanted the world to learn from his story. He declined most interviews, but when pressed, he submitted a single statement for public record, a short paragraph published in scientific journals, parenting magazines, and courtroom ethics blogs. Because the best way to win a battle is to make sure no one has to fight it again. Captain Halden Trusk stood expressionless as the verdict echoed through the silent chamber. Permanently barred from operating or serving aboard any commercial or private aircraft. 4 years in federal custody, no parole. The tribunal's final ruling struck like a gavel in a thunderstorm, but Halden didn't flinch. Not yet. His jaw tightened. His fingers curled beneath the table. But behind his practiced stoicism, a tremor had begun. Slow, invisible, but irreversible. Seated only a few rows behind him, Dr. Marcell Varron watched with unreadable eyes. Leron wasn't with him this time. Bram Vaylor had offered to stay outside with the boy. The courtroom's air felt thick, not with drama, but with the weight of consequence. Magistrate Darvin Kell's voice remained composed as he continued. "These charges are not merely procedural failures, Captain. They represent a deliberate abuse of authority, a breach of human dignity, and a gross misuse of restricted sedation tools aboard a civilian flight." His gaze sharpened as it landed on Halden. "Your actions threatened not just a father and child, but the trust every citizen places in those who command the skies." Halden tried to speak. "Your Honor, I..." But his attorney subtly touched his arm, signaling silence. The timing was gone. The moment to control the narrative had slipped from his grasp days ago. Corvin Malrus sat at a separate table, visibly paler than during the initial hearings. His hands fidgeted with the cuff of his jacket, and he avoided Marcell's line of sight. The tribunal's ruling on him was more tempered, limited immunity granted in exchange for full testimony and corroborating statements. But the cost was not light. He would be completing 1,000 hours of mandatory community service in aviation ethics outreach. A phrase that had once meant nothing now meant everything. Corvin gave a single, weak nod as the ruling was read aloud. He had chosen to testify at the 11th hour, tearfully, reluctantly, but truthfully. Redden Vale's name was mentioned next, but with none of the weight of shame. "Mr. Vale," Kell said, "your immediate action in preserving cockpit recordings and flagging falsified authority tags has been reviewed and commended. Effective immediately, you are reinstated and promoted to Oversight Captain under the newly restructured Federal Aviation Monitoring Bureau." Vale stood only briefly, nodded once, and sat again. His face remained firm, but his shoulders slackened ever so slightly. Relief without triumph. The courtroom's walls displayed live bulletins of the ruling as legal observers took notes in rapid keystrokes. Across the industry, eyes were locked on this chamber not because of the man in shackles, but because of the clause just ratified. "The tribunal unanimously passes the Varron provision," Kell continued. "All cabin restraint equipment aboard certified aircraft will henceforth be tracked in real time with mandatory transparency protocols. Use of force incidents must be reviewed by an independent ethics AI within 2 hours of landing. Post-incident logs will be made available to both passengers and legal observers." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. For those in the aviation field, this was more than policy. It was a paradigm shift. Until now, restraint incidents were buried beneath paperwork, misfiled, lost in classified maintenance logs. Now, the doors had been flung open. Outside, reporters crowded the terminal's plaza. Inside, one camera feed captured Marcell as the tribunal clerk approached with a commemorative plaque. "Dr. Varron, the committee would like to offer a ceremonial recognition for your resilience and for advancing federal aviation reform." Marcell raised a hand gently. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, his voice clear but calm. "But I decline." The clerk hesitated. "Are you sure? It will be included in—" "I'm sure," Marcell replied, standing. He adjusted his blazer, glanced briefly at Corvin, then Halden, and finally at the front of the courtroom where Magistrate Kell still presided. "Some things don't need a plaque. They need to be fixed." He stepped away before anyone could argue. Journalists followed him as far as the exit, but he ignored their questions. He had already spoken, just not with a microphone. That evening, as news broke nationwide, forums, blogs, and legal roundtables echoed with a single sentence posted by Marcell hours after the ruling. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't attached to a profile picture. Just a simple, time-stamped statement that traveled further than any televised interview ever could. "Authority unchecked is a risk to all. But truth documented is the dart that flies back, sharper and louder than any weapon you aim in silence." The question came without warning, dropped like a pebble into a still lake. "Dad, why did that man try to hurt you?" Marcell Varron blinked, the wind stirring the grass around him as he looked down at his son. They were sitting beneath the wide old tree in Corin Hollow, the same tree Marcell had climbed as a boy and now returned to with his own. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns across Leron's curious face, now fuller and healthier than it had been in months. Marcell didn't answer right away. The question was simple, but the weight behind it wasn't. He reached for a nearby stick and drew a slow line in the dirt between them. His hand, once punctured by a tranquilizer dart, still ached when he moved it certain ways, but it wasn't the pain that stopped him. It was the truth. "Some men fear what they can't control," he finally said, his voice steady, almost too calm. "And when they feel powerless, they try to take control in the worst ways." Leron looked down at the dirt line. "But you didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Marcell nodded, offering a tired smile. "That's why we kept telling the truth, even when it didn't look like anyone was listening." He exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the sky, the memory of the plane still sharp in his mind. Not the violence, but the restraint. The choice to endure, to document, to wait. The tranquilizer. the raised weapon, the eyes of passengers wide with horror. He could still hear the click of the wristband recorder and feel the cold precision of his own mind pulling every thread into place while everything else burned around him. Leron had cried then, harder than he ever had in his life, and now the boy looked like he was trying to understand a storm that hadn't touched his skin, only his spirit. "Were you scared?" the boy asked. Marcell hesitated. "Yes," he said truthfully, "but not for me." A silence passed between them, not awkward but necessary, the kind that only grows between two people who survived something together. In the months since the incident, life hadn't gone back to normal. It had gone forward into something new. The tribunal had made its decision. Halden was grounded, permanently. The Tranquilizer assault had ignited changes Marcell didn't expect to witness in his lifetime. Cabin safety laws restructured, ethics boards reshuffled, simulators rebuilt with scenarios drawn from what happened on Flight 912. And yet, despite all the reports, the interviews, the rulings, this moment, under this tree, felt like the only real conclusion. A soft breeze blew, rustling the leaves overhead. In the distance, the town of Corin Hollow moved at its usual pace, slow, unhurried, but changed in the quiet way things change after they've been stirred deeply. The world had not seen Marcell Varron as a hero, and he was fine with that. He didn't need the courtroom applause or the articles titled "The Engineer Who Defied the Sky." What mattered to him sat right beside him, 6 years old, breathing steadily, asking questions because he felt safe enough to. His wrist still bore a mark from the dart, and nearby, a small glass case sat on a wooden bench, propped beneath the tree's roots. Inside it was the original wristband prototype. Not polished, not mass-produced, just the version he'd built by hand in a workshop over a decade earlier for biometric recording during hypobaric pressure simulations. It had recorded everything that day, every accusation, every raised voice, every unlawful command. Now it rested in quiet tribute, the engraved plate beneath it catching the afternoon light. Leron leaned forward and read the line out loud, slowly. The return shot wasn't fired in anger. It was written in evidence. Despite the burn, the CEO stepped into the cockpit, guided the jet safely down, and signed the contract that changed everything. Meanwhile, the attacker faced consequences he never imagined. If you believe real authority moves silently, powerfully, and decisively, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, abuse of power, and the moment accountability and law confront arrogance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, integrity, and standing up for justice within the bounds of the law.